What if the suffering you've been feeling about things that haven't happened yet, the dread, the weight, the physical tightness that arrives days or weeks before a difficult moment, sometimes before a moment that never even arrives, what if that suffering was not anxiety? What if it was something more specific than that, with a precise name, a well-documented mechanism, and a completely different set of interventions than the ones you've been trying? And what if knowing the name and understanding the mechanism was the thing that finally made the experience stop feeling like something permanently wrong with you and start feeling like something that can actually be addressed? Because it is. And the reason the name matters, the reason I'm giving it to you first instead of building toward it, is that most people who live with this have been calling it anxiety for so long that they've stopped looking for anything more specific. They've accepted the general category and missed the precise thing inside it. And precision is where the change lives. Vague problems get vague solutions. When you know exactly what you're dealing with, you know exactly what actually works on it. Here's the name. And then I'm going to show you everything. The name is anticipatory anxiety. And before you think that's just a fancy phrase for worrying about the future, stay with me. Because anticipatory anxiety is not just worry. It is a specific neurological process in which your brain generates a full emotional and physical experience of a future event before that event occurs. Not a thought about the event. Not a concern about the event. An experience of it. Your body responds to the imagined future the way it would respond to the actual present. The cortisol releases. The muscles contract. The heart rate shifts. The stomach tightens. The dread is physiologically real, even though the thing producing it does not exist yet. This is the part that makes anticipatory anxiety so specifically exhausting and so specifically hard to reason your way out of. You are not being irrational. You are not making a logical error that can be corrected by thinking more clearly. You are having a genuine physical experience produced by your brain's simulation of something that hasn't happened. And a physical experience doesn't care about your intellectual understanding that it isn't real yet. The body is not listening to the part of you that knows the event is in the future. The body is responding to the signal it's receiving, and the signal says the threat is now. Here's what's happening in the brain when this runs, because the mechanism explains both why it's so hard to stop and exactly where to interrupt it. Your brain has a simulation system. A remarkably powerful one. It is designed to model future events in enough detail that you can prepare for them effectively. This system is one of the most sophisticated things the human brain does. The ability to mentally travel forward in time, to imagine what might happen, to use that imagination to make better decisions in the present. In the right circumstances, with the right calibration, it is genuinely useful. It is why you can plan, prepare, anticipate needs, foresee consequences. But the simulation system does not come with a built-in emotional dial that distinguishes between simulating something for information and simulating something for experience. When the simulation is vivid enough, detailed enough, emotionally charged enough, the brain processes it the same way it processes reality. The amygdala, which is responsible for threat detection and emotional response, does not stamp incoming signals with the label imagined versus real. It reads the signal and responds. And if the signal contains the content of threat, conflict, rejection, failure, loss, humiliation, pain, it responds to that content regardless of whether the source is actual or simulated. So when you lie awake the night before a difficult conversation running through how it might go wrong, you are not just thinking about the conversation. You are running your brain's simulation engine at high resolution on a threat scenario, and your amygdala is responding to every iteration of it in real time. Every version where it goes badly produces a real stress response. Every imagined rejection produces a real emotional sting. Every simulated failure produces real cortisol. And by the time the actual event arrives, if it arrives, you have already lived through dozens of versions of it. You are exhausted before it begins. And when it ends, even if it went fine, the relief is muted because some part of you already spent most of the emotional energy processing an event that never quite happened the way you imagined. Now here's the piece that makes this specifically a pattern rather than just an occasional experience. The simulation doesn't run neutrally. It doesn't generate equal numbers of positive and negative scenarios and present them to you as balanced possibilities. It is heavily, systematically biased toward threat, toward the version where things go wrong, toward the outcome that confirms the fear rather than the one that relieves it. And this bias is not random. It's a feature, not a bug. A brain calibrated for survival weights negative outcomes more heavily because the cost of underestimating a threat historically has been much higher than the cost of overestimating one. Missing a real danger is catastrophic. Dreading a danger that doesn't materialize is merely uncomfortable. So the simulation runs worst-case scenarios not because your brain is broken but because your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is that it evolved in a world of physical threats where the simulation was running scenarios that looked like predators and scarcity and tribal conflict. And now it is running the same system on social situations, on professional outcomes, on relationship dynamics, threats that are real in their own way but that rarely require the level of physiological mobilization that the simulation is producing. Your brain is treating your performance review, or the difficult conversation, or the uncertain outcome of something you care about, with the same threat response it would generate for something genuinely life-threatening. And you are paying the full biological cost of that response, in suffering, in exhaustion, in the pre-experience of events that may never happen, for situations that almost never end as badly as the simulation predicted. Here is the first intervention. Right now, because you've been in the simulation long enough. The intervention is called diffusion, and it comes from a very specific and very well-supported area of psychology. Diffusion is the practice of creating distance between you and the content of the simulation, not by stopping the thoughts, not by replacing them with better thoughts, not by arguing with them, but by changing your relationship to them so that they lose their authority over your body. The simulation generates a thought. Something like, this is going to go badly, I'm going to say the wrong thing, they're going to think less of me, I won't be able to handle it. And normally, when that thought arrives, you treat it as information, as something close to fact. Your body responds to it as if it is a reliable report about what is going to happen. Because it's coming from inside you and it feels true and it feels urgent and nothing in the moment is contradicting it. Diffusion interrupts that process by changing the label you put on the thought. Instead of receiving it as information about the future, you receive it as output from the simulation engine. Instead of, this is going to go badly, you notice, my brain is generating a negative simulation of this event. That's not a semantic game. That is a genuinely different cognitive position. Because the first version treats the thought as a window onto reality. The second version treats it as a product of a biological system that is doing what it was designed to do but is not a reliable prophet. You are not the simulation. You are the one the simulation is running in. And the moment you can feel the difference between those two things, even briefly, even imperfectly, the physical response to the simulation begins to soften. Because the amygdala is not just responding to the content of the thought. It is responding to how much authority you are granting it. And diffusion reduces the authority without requiring the thought to stop. There's something about the suffering itself that I want to name clearly, because I think it's the part that most generates the sense of something being permanently wrong with you. The suffering feels disproportionate. You know it's disproportionate. You know intellectually that the thing you're dreading is probably not as bad as you're experiencing it. You know that you've gotten through hard things before. You know that most of the worst-case scenarios your simulation generates never actually materialize. And you know all of that, and it makes almost no difference to the suffering. Which then creates a secondary layer, the suffering about the suffering. The frustration, the self-criticism, the why am I like this, the everyone else seems to handle uncertainty without feeling this way. That secondary layer is often worse than the original anticipatory anxiety. And it is entirely produced by the expectation that knowing better should mean feeling better. But knowing and feeling are processed by different systems. Knowing is cortical, it lives in the thinking brain. Feeling is subcortical, it lives in the body and the emotional brain, and it responds to experience and signal and accumulated evidence, not to intellectual argument. You cannot logic your way out of a physiological state. You can only introduce a different physiological input that changes the state from the inside. Which means the self-criticism for not being able to think your way out of it is not only unhelpful but specifically counterproductive. Because self-criticism is itself a threat signal. And threat signals, arriving on top of the existing anticipatory anxiety, amplify the alarm rather than quiet it. Every time you criticize yourself for feeling the dread, you give the nervous system one more piece of data confirming that the current situation is dangerous and requires a stress response. Dropping the self-criticism is not lowering your standards. It is removing a source of threat signal that is actively making the physiological state worse. It is choosing accuracy over punishment. And accuracy says, this is what a well-designed brain does in the presence of something it cares about and cannot fully control. It generates simulations. It produces anticipatory distress. It is doing its job in a world that no longer requires this version of its job. And responding to that with kindness rather than criticism is not weakness. It is the fastest available route to a calmer nervous system. The second intervention goes directly at the simulation's fuel source. The simulation runs on uncertainty. It cannot operate in the absence of something unknown because the simulation is, by definition, an attempt to model what is not yet determined. And uncertainty is unavoidable. The future is always uncertain. Every situation involving other people or outcomes you can't fully control is uncertain, and no amount of thinking resolves the uncertainty, it just generates more detailed simulations of it. But not all uncertainty is equal in the way the simulation treats it. The simulation is significantly more activated by uncertainty that feels personal and evaluative. Situations where the outcome says something about your worth, your competence, your lovability, your adequacy. A delayed flight activates the simulation mildly. A performance review activates it intensely. A medical test activates it in a completely different register. Not because the uncertainty is objectively worse but because the personal stakes feel higher. Because the simulation is not just modeling what will happen. It is modeling what will happen will mean about you. And this is where the work goes deeper than technique. Because as long as uncertain outcomes carry the weight of self-evaluation, as long as how things go is also a verdict on whether you are okay, the simulation will always have maximum fuel. Every situation with an unknown outcome will activate the full threat response. Because the threat is not just the outcome. The threat is the judgment. The threat is the possibility that the result will confirm the fear you already carry about whether you are enough. The work at this level is not managing the simulation. It is separating your worth from the outcome. Not by pretending outcomes don't matter, they do. But by building, through experience and through honest reflection, a stable enough sense of your own value that a bad outcome can be a bad outcome without also being a verdict. That a difficult conversation can go wrong without it meaning something permanent about who you are. That failure can be failure without it being proof of something you feared about yourself all along. That separation doesn't happen in one moment of insight. It happens through accumulated experience of surviving bad outcomes without being destroyed by them. Through noticing, again and again, that the feared verdict never quite arrives the way the simulation predicted. Through gradually, honestly building the evidence that your worth is not actually on the line every time an outcome is uncertain. There's one more thing I want to give you, and it's the most practical and the most immediate. The suffering before the event is almost always worse than the event itself. You know this. You have the evidence. You have been through enough anticipated hardships and enough actual hardships to have seen the pattern clearly. The simulation predicted suffering at a level of 10, the actual experience was a 6, and you spent 3 times as long in the imagined suffering as in the real one. And you know this. And it makes almost no difference in the moment because the simulation doesn't update from your previous experience of its inaccuracy. Every new uncertain event gets a fresh worst-case projection, untouched by your track record of surviving. So here is the practice. It's simple, and it requires a kind of discipline that is different from willpower. The next time you catch the simulation running, the next time you feel the pre-suffering of something that hasn't happened, you ask it one question. Not to argue with it, not to dismiss it, not to tell it it's wrong. Just this. What do I actually know about this situation right now, in this moment, that is real? Not what might happen. Not what could go wrong. Not what the simulation is generating. What is actually, factually, presently true. And almost every time, the answer reveals the same gap. What is actually true is small and manageable and survivable. What the simulation generated was large and catastrophic and exhausting. And standing in the actual present rather than the simulated future, even for 30 seconds, changes the physiological state in a way that no amount of knowing the simulation is wrong ever could. You cannot stop the simulation from running. It is biological, it is automatic, it is faster than your conscious intention. But you can refuse to live inside it as if it is reality. You can notice it running, name it accurately as a simulation, return to what is actually present, and do that again and again until the gap between what the simulation predicted and what actually happened becomes the evidence your nervous system finally uses to recalibrate. You have been suffering events that haven't happened yet for a long time. Some of them never happened. Some of them happened but were nothing like the simulation. And some of them were genuinely hard, and you handled them. Not because you saw them coming. Not because the simulation prepared you. Because you are someone who handles things when they actually arrive, even when the simulation was certain you couldn't. That's what anticipatory anxiety takes from you. Not your capacity to handle things. It never touches that. It takes the time before the thing. It takes the days and nights of the pre-event. It takes the presence that should have been available to you in those moments and fills them with a version of suffering that belongs to a future that isn't real yet and often never becomes real in the way the simulation promised it would. The name won't stop the simulation from running. But knowing the name means you know what you're dealing with. And knowing what you're dealing with means you stop treating it as evidence of something broken and start treating it as a system running too loud in a context that no longer requires it. A system that can be interrupted, that can be diffused, that can be returned to the actual present moment where almost always, right now, today, in this specific moment, there is no emergency. There is only the simulation of one. And the simulation is not the future. It is just your brain doing what brains do. And you are not your brain doing what brains do. You are the one who decides what to do next.